Well, welcome everyone. My name is Adam Savit. I'm Director of Communications at the Center for Security Policy. Welcome to the latest event in our webinar series. Today's program is entitled, How the COVID-19 Pandemic Exposes America's Need for Resilient Critical Infrastructure, featuring Tommy Waller and Dr. Peter Pry. Before we begin, I just have a couple housekeeping items. First of all, you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit text questions at the very bottom of the Zoom app using the Q&A button. And I will submit questions to our panelists towards the end of the program. We will be recording this event. It will be archived on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/securefreedom, as well as on our website, securefreedom.org. With that, I'll hand this over to my colleague, our Director for Infrastructure Security, as well as a combat veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, Tommy Waller.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate you making this possible for us. I do want to mention, you mentioned my service in the Marines. Oftentimes people thank me for that service. And before we get started, because we are going to talk about our critical infrastructure, I just want to highlight the appreciation that I have for the people who maintain that critical infrastructure. There's nothing that I've ever done in uniform or would ever do in uniform that would pale in comparison as a service to this nation to those who keep the lights on. So I want to preface our discussion with that thankfulness for that service. The next thing I want to do is I want to introduce our really the star of this webinar, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. You have access to Dr. Pry's bio in the webinar link, and I'm not going to take up the time in this webinar to go through all of that and all the positions that he's held in the past or the positions he holds now. What I'm going to tell you is that this man has provided for me and many, many others the inspiration to both understand what threatens our critical infrastructure, and particularly the U.S. electric grid, and to also understand what to do about it. This is a man who, when I read the Declaration of Independence and you look at the very last line of it, he is the guy I think about most when it comes to having sacrificed for this particular topic of protecting this most critical infrastructure. This copy of the Constitution that I have here with me was given to me by the parents of one of my fallen Marines, an only child. And they challenged me to never forget what he died for. And I'm going to read that last line of the Declaration of Independence. And I want you to know that our guest, Dr. Pry, embodies this, that we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. When it comes to the strategic threats facing the United States, and in particular those threats to our critical infrastructure, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry has given it all. And so with that introduction, Dr. Pry, I really appreciate you being on this webinar, taking this time with us. Dr. Pry holds 2 PhDs, one in history and one in strategic studies. And one of the reasons why we asked him to be on is because of this distinct knowledge of history, particularly military history, and his insights into what the current pandemic, this one that originated, as we know, in Wuhan, China, what it's done to our country and to the world, but to put that in context so that we can understand what we're seeing now in relation to what's happened in the past. And so, Dr. Pry, you recently authored what I consider to be an excellent article in the Washington Times. You originally titled it, Coronavirus, Our Plague of Justinian. I'd ask you to just take a few moments to go through that article, the things that you mentioned about previous plagues and their effects on human history, so we can compare that to what we're facing now.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Tommy. Right, one of the points about the coronavirus, one of the main points I'm making, that as a plague, it hardly deserves to be described as such when it's compared to the truly great plagues of history. Most people know about the one that is most common, the bubonic plague that swept through Western Europe during the Middle Ages, during the late medieval period, in the mid-1300s, and killed 1/4 to perhaps as many as a half of the population of Western Europe. The coronavirus mortality rate is getting lower and lower every time we look at it. It's less than 1%. And yet look what it's done to our society, compared to the real existential threat that was represented by the bubonic plague. Another significant plague in history was the Antonine Plague that affected the Roman Empire during the reign of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, when he was on the frontier and on the Rhineland fighting the Germans, trying to hold the Germans back. And we think this plague was probably the measles or smallpox, and it came from Asia. By the way, all of these plagues that I'm describing all came from Asia to Europe, and in fact, a lot of them actually came from China, what was then China, the region of China, including the Antonine Plague, which was measles and smallpox, and the Romans hadn't been exposed to that, and it caused tremendous numbers of deaths, perhaps as many as 5 million deaths throughout the Roman Empire, and it significantly weakened the Roman legions to such a point that Marcus Aurelius was concerned that he wasn't able to hold back the barbarians. And it was one of the things that stopped Roman expansion, so that the empire didn't go beyond the Rhineland, for example. And it gave them problems with their eastern frontiers against the Parthians as well, and so basically stopped the expansion of the Roman Empire. Another plague, perhaps the greatest, one of the greatest plagues in history, which has no name, was the plague that was brought to North America with Columbus's discovery, and then the European colonization in the 3 centuries after the discovery of America by Columbus. The Native Americans had no immunity to things like smallpox and measles, and it swept through from the tip of South America and Tierra del Fuego all the way up to the Arctic Circle with the Eskimos. It just swept through. And even before people arrived, 90% or more of the original peoples who populated North America, the Native Americans, were killed by that plague, which is certainly one of the great plagues in history, if not the greatest. And it was obviously transformative because it, in effect, emptied 2 continents, opening them up for resettlement by Europeans, creating, the modern world that we have today. The great plague that the article is titled after, the Plague of Justinian, happened after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire was taken over by barbarians, and all that was left was the Eastern Roman Empire. At the time, it was called the Byzantine Empire. We're talking about 500 AD, thereabouts. The Western Roman Empire, had fallen around 476 AD. That's the famous sacking of Rome that happened by the barbarians. It's usually taken as the point by historians, 476 AD, when the Western Roman Empire collapsed. And Justinian had been on the verge of reestablishing the Roman Empire. His armies had gone into Spain and North Africa and Italy, and most of what had been the original Roman Empire in the West was reconquered by him. And he was on the verge of pulling it all together. And then they got hit by the plague of Justinian. We don't know what it was. Some historians think that it might have been the bubonic plague coming early, and a prequel to the bubonic plague that swept through Europe, because it seems to have had similarly devastating effects in terms of the percentage of people killed. Something like the historian Procopius, who lived at the time of Justinian, writes about 10,000 people dying every day just in the capital in Constantinople. And half the farmers, the small farmers and landowners, people who produced food, were wiped out through the existing Roman Empire, making it impossible for Justinian to raise money. He was so desperate for finances to sustain his legions, to sustain his consequences, that he was actually trying to force the farmers who weren't dead to not only pay their taxes, but to pay higher taxes, including the taxes of their neighbors who had died from the plague. And
that was the point I wanted to really, that to me is what hit home. I think it was the last line of your article where you talked about, I printed it out, now saving Pax Americana may be as unrealistic as Justinian's hopes to resurrect the Roman Empire, as Justinian learned when there is no money, to build new legions, the barbarians win. I'd like you to drill down on that in relation to what we're facing today.
Yeah, that was the main point of my article, really, because the historical parallels between the plague of Justinian and what we are facing today were just remarkable to me, which is why I wrote the article in the first place. You know, here Justinian was on the verge of changing history. I mean, the history of Western civilization would have changed profoundly if the Roman Empire had been reestablished. You know, instead of collapsing into the Dark Ages, which is what happened. You know, it took 1,000 years for Europe. Most historians think that we didn't claw our way back to the technological level and the level of science and literacy until the early 19th century. That's how long it took for us to recover from the collapse of the Roman Empire. And imagine if Justinian had succeeded and the Roman Empire was reunited, we might have had the Industrial Revolution centuries before it actually happened. And we would be today centuries ahead of where we are. But that didn't happen. Instead, we had the Dark Ages because of that great plague. And the parallel with us today is that, you know, America, the world order, the peaceful, benign, it's the most benign world order that has ever existed in human history. The world order that was established by the United States at the end of World War II in 1945, that's been led by the United States, the belief in freedom, the belief in political and economic democracy, you know, which not only is an example, but the United States has used this benign world order to advance the cause of freedom and political and economic freedom around the world. And it has also benefited itself. All the free systems have benefited themselves from this benign world order, which is under extremely serious challenge now. You know, when the United States first established that world order, it was able to sustain it because we actually produced half of the gross national product of the entire world. You know, the United States basically was such an economic powerhouse in the aftermath of World War II, and the other economies of the world were so destroyed that half the world's wealth every year was being produced just by the United States. Now that situation has changed. You know, we are still the leading economic power in the world, but our fraction of the world's wealth that we produce is someplace in the neighborhood of maybe 10% of that. And also, we had a huge technological lead over our adversaries. You know, we had invented the atomic bomb. You know, we were far ahead of them in aircraft technology and missile technology. And all of that has changed, where our adversaries are actually ahead of us now in a lot of these things, including new ways of warfare that we haven't even quite figured out yet, like cyber warfare, super EMP weapons, combined armed cyber warfare of that type, new generation nuclear weapons that we don't have any equivalent to in our arsenal. And so we're under very serious challenge from Russia, China, even North Korea and Iran, that become giant killers when they get armed with weapons of mass destruction. But President Trump, because of his rebuilding of the US military and his recovery of our economy, you know, people, it's just so easy to forget, but just 2 months ago, the United States had the greatest economic growth, and we had the greatest economy, not only in our history, but probably in world history, you know, of any great state. So he had reconstituted, the president, Trump, had reconstituted, or was in the process of reconstituting, the military and economic power that might have made it just possible for the United States to sustain this world-led global order that has served the interests of mankind so well. But now we find ourselves, you know, on the really in an economic situation that is equivalent to the Great Depression, not just a recession. 40 million Americans out of work, you know, small businesses destroyed in just 2 months. I mean, it's worse than what happened during the Great Depression in terms of the speed of the economic collapse. And consequently, the tax base isn't there. And our own Department of Defense is very pessimistic about the future. Secretary of Defense Esper has been talking about hoping that we can have flat defense budgets in the future. He's talking about flat defense budgets as an optimistic thing, because the reality is, if these if this economic downturn continues, we're going to have deep cuts in the defense budget. We won't be able to sustain flat defense budgets, let alone the defense budget growth that President Trump was engaged in and which was necessary in order for us to rebuild our military strength. And so that's the parallel between the two. Just as Justinian's plans and the whole course of Western civilization, the history of Western civilization and human history, was changed by the plague of Justinian by destroying the wealth that was necessary for him to build new legions to bring back Roman civilization. So our world order, this benign world order, is suddenly threatened by the policies. And that's the thing that is so embittering, and because it isn't the so-called plague, the coronavirus plague, which, as I said before, compared to the truly great plagues of history, I mean, this thing doesn't deserve to be called a plague. The mortality rate is so low. But the reaction of our governments at all levels, many would say, including myself, the gross overreaction of government to have deliberately shut down the economy, to have been deliberately engaged in draconian social measures that go so far that they impose upon people's civil liberties. It's a self-inflicted wound that could be as catastrophic to our future as the plague of Justinian. Because now hopefully the administration is hoping for what is called a V-shaped recovery, and there are some signs that might be right. Some serious economists are saying, well, this is going to be like a natural disaster, and once we get past the coronavirus thing, we'll have a rapid economic recovery. And there have been some signs just recently that maybe that'll happen, and I pray to God it happens that way.
Right.
But until it does happen, I'm going to remain skeptical. I can go on and tell you why I can remain skeptical, but it looks like you might have another question or something.
Well, absolutely. And there's a couple of key points that I want to bring out of what you just mentioned. One of them is the draconian, if we want to call it that, methods that were applied. Some of this came, I think, because they didn't know what to do because we weren't prepared. We had long been warned about pandemics, but the government didn't prepare. And I know there was another article that you wrote at the onset of this pandemic where you discussed the fact that this has been talked about a lot in the past, and in fact, even war games. Tell us about the 2001 war game that the CSIS and Johns Hopkins conducted on a pandemic, and what we thought the effect would be of that, Peter.
Yeah, that was called Dark Winter. And that was done by CSIS and the Johns Hopkins Center for Biological Defense Studies. And I was actually in the room at the House Armed Services Committee. I was on the HASC staff at the time when they showed the Dark Winter. And I remember the moment that I knew that our political leaders in the Congress, at least in the House Armed Services Committee, were going to do something. They were going to try to do something. They were going to pass policies to address the biological warfare threat. And it's when they had a picture of a smallpox victim, which is just horrific. I mean, it's a horrific disease. If you have no immunity to it and you're afflicted by smallpox, that was the scenario, that a genetically engineered smallpox that would, against which we would have no immunity. So it would be sort of like doing to the current North American civilization the kind of smallpox disease that affected the native North American peoples after Columbus, because it would be genetically engineered so that our immunities wouldn't work against it. And going back before Dark Winter, because the story is even worse than that. I was pointing out in that article that 20 years ago, we were taking this threat seriously, and all kinds of policies were passed to ensure that we would be protected against biological warfare. But it actually goes back decades before that. We've known since the 50s and 60s about biological warfare, and the Defense Department is supposed to have been taking it seriously and being prepared for it. We even have a high-ranking position called the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense. I mean, it's his job, and I find it interesting. nobody has even interviewed that guy, okay, during the coronavirus, because he's the guy in the Pentagon that's supposed to be ready for this. And that's why we have the Center for Disease Control and the National Institute of Health. That wasn't put together just to, to fight obesity. The original reason for those institutions was a part of our defense against biological warfare. So we've had decades and billions of dollars invested so that we should have been prepared for this threat. And I would have, that's one of the most shocking things to me about the coronavirus incident, that government just failed at all levels. The Center for Disease Control, NIH failed, the Pentagon failed, the Department of Homeland Security failed. Nobody was ready. And it's appalling to think of how unready they were. If you were an intelligent high school student and you were tasked by Congress and the president to say, well, get ready for biological warfare. It doesn't take any genius to know you should be stockpiling ventilators and pharmaceuticals and masks and hospital robes and those kinds of things, and have some kind of arrangement with the pharmaceutical industry so that you can quickly go into mass production. There are more sophisticated things that could and should have been done too, like using the supercomputers out at our national laboratories, to basically go through the permutations of what kind of viruses could have come out of the coronavirus. All right. Now, there's millions of combinations, an infinite number of combinations, but the supercomputers can do almost infinite numbers of permutations and combinations. And you could have for each one, a file cabinet, a computer file cabinet of, well, this looks like a cure for this kind of a disease, and have that on file. If you came close, it would greatly reduce the amount of time that you would need to respond to the crisis.
Right.
But they failed so badly that the President of the United States himself had to step up and take over and basically run our response to the coronavirus. And one of the worst failures, I think, is that they completely miscalculated how serious it was going to be. I think in retrospect, this is my view, but I know it's shared by a lot of people, that the social distancing and the shutting down of the economy, I think, was probably unnecessary. That this was based on a gross miscalculation of what the mortality rate and how infectious this thing was going to be. And so it's been a catastrophic failure. And my concern, I guess we're going to link this to the EMP issue. Maybe I'll let you get in a word edgewise now. But that's my concern about the coronavirus, that it demonstrates maybe our civilization has reached a point, sort of like the Romans, where we're just not competent anymore. Every civilization goes through the cycle of, you start off at a point early in your civilization where you have really high competence. And I think a lot of times that's because you have people who are great generals and great political leaders and maybe, great merchants who know how to do things. They actually know how to do things. And so we had people like that who enabled us to win World War II, invent the atomic bomb, and build the national highway system, and send a man to the moon, and do all kinds of things so that people might even be convinced that socialism could work because the government was so competent in the America that I grew up in. But now we're in an America where they can't even design a web page for Obamacare that will work. Right. Remember when the U.S. Army tried to, there are all kinds of failures you look to, and it's hard to point to any big significant success, this coronavirus being the latest sign of gross incompetence. And why is that? It's because the people who are in charge are, we're sort of into, just like the Romans, they instead of the generals and the highly competent people, eventually the empire was run by freedmen and slaves, who answered directly to the emperor. And so you had multiple generations of bureaucrats who really didn't know how to do anything except, feather their own nests and evade responsibility. And I think, that's probably where we are today, where we've got, second, third generation bureaucrats who have gotten their jobs from their fathers and their grandfathers, and they've never done anything in the private sector, never accomplished anything, haven't had to, because they've got these cushy, very well-paid senior executive service jobs, and what they're masters at really is doing nothing and evading responsibility.
I think what you illustrated, Peter, is a swamp. And I have to say that, and you and I both know that there are some really good civil servants in government that are just doing their best to try to contend with all of these challenges. You mentioned President Trump having to take charge, and I think he did. I mean, I think personally, when I walk into a Trump hotel and I look at that, I think to myself, this is a man who built something, who did something. And I think the president has tried as hard as he can in his response to the coronavirus. One of the things that I know both of us are inspired about, because we both had the blessing to have had the opportunity, you especially, to brief then candidate Donald Trump on the vulnerability of the U.S. electric grid back in 2015. Both of us appreciate the fact that he understands a key point. You made a point earlier about the fact that the dark ages really you could argue that its effects lasted until the 19th century. And I want to illustrate something that Dr. Michael Osterholm wrote in his book about infectious disease. This is an outspoken physician here during the current pandemic. He discussed the fact that the life expectancy for humans up until around 1900 really didn't go much past the age of 50, really around the age of 44. And he credits the father of modern health to be Nikola Tesla, because he illustrates the dependency on modern health and on our lives, on the importance of electricity. And that's something I think that we need to take some comfort in, knowing that our commander-in-chief understands that nexus between the importance of electricity and all the critical infrastructures upon which it depends, and our own survival and our national security. And so what I wanted to do was to give you an opportunity, you having been the chief of staff of the Congressional EMP Commission, that's the Congressional Electromagnetic Pulse Commission, to share with the audience a little bit of your experience. Number one, for those that are not familiar with EMP, natural or man-made, to give us a little bit of a definition, a common man definition of what that is, and then talk a little bit about its effects on critical infrastructure and your experience having been really one of the leading voices in the world on this very topic.
Okay, sure, Tommy. What is EMP? In Physics 101, an electromagnetic pulse is caused by a moving magnetic field, that will cause current to move through a wire. In common sense, more common, and everybody listening to this has experienced something like an EMP. I'm sure everybody listening has had the experience of driving in your car, going down the road with the radio on. And then you've passed under high power lines and the radio doesn't work, you get interference. And then you come out on the other side and it suddenly works again. Well, what has happened is you basically passed through a magnetic field that interferes with the operation of your radio. If the field was strong enough, if those wires were lower and they weren't insulated, because the utilities know they have to insulate those wires when they go across a highway, and they have to put them at high enough so they don't destroy your car and destroy your radio. And that could happen. I mean, imagine a field that is much more powerful than that. That a field that's so powerful that it could actually fry your radio, fry your car, destroy any kind of electronic components that are in that field. Now imagine that this field is not just a small spot on the highway, but it covers the whole North American continent, okay? That's what a nuclear EMP looks like. That is what North Korea could do with a single nuclear weapon detonated at high altitude in outer space. Imagine a field so powerful or so big that the whole world is affected. And electronics, electric grids and communication systems all over the world would be collapsed by this worldwide electromagnetic field. That's what the sun can do. That's what it'll try to do someday. It's what happened in 1859 when the Carrington event happened. And the telegraph systems, which existed on every continent except Antarctica in 1859, were destroyed and damaged by the EMP field, the natural EMP field from the Carrington event. Now, civilization didn't end in 1859 because they were not yet an electronic civilization. But we are an electronic civilization today. You know, we can only sustain a population of 330 million people because of our electronic technology, the electric grids, water purification systems that require vast amounts of electricity to pump water to the cities, to purify the water, refrigeration and temperature control systems so that the food supply is preserved, refrigerated trucks that can move food to warehouses so you can buy an apple that was harvested in the state of Washington and Washington, D.C. On the EMP Commission, we actually traced the history of an apple purchased in Washington, D.C. to find out, well, how did it get here? Where did it come from? It was actually harvested mechanically in the state of Washington and transshipped by truck over the country. You know, what we have here, the reason we can sustain such a large population today is because of our electronic civilization, which is a technological miracle. And what you need to, if you think of EMP as an anti-technology phenomenon. What it does is it subtracts technology, electronic technology, from the equation of civilization. And the effects would be catastrophic. It's the worst thing that could happen to us. It's why I and others have devoted our professional lives to this, because if our civilization continues to be unprotected from a man-made EMP, and you don't need a nuclear weapon, by the way, it can also be done by non-nuclear weapons, or a natural EMP, as like an EMP from the sun, you know, up to 90% of our population could die in 1 year, you know, from a protracted blackout that would take out not just the electric grid, but all the life-sustaining critical infrastructures that are powered by the electric grid. You know, water, communications, transportation, business and finance, all of it would go away. And we would fall below where we were in the 19th century, because the critical infrastructures that we had in the 19th century, coal-fired locomotives, an agricultural, horse-driven economy that feeds the cities, a market economy to feed, none of that exists anymore. And so our population would be in even bigger trouble, and then going into a time machine and going back 100 years, as some people. That's actually an optimistic appraisal.
Right.
You know, it would really be like going back to the dark ages.
Absolutely. And Peter, that's one of the things I wanted to illustrate is, and it's really the point of the webinar, is to think about the effects of COVID-19, the Wuhan virus, right? What is it doing to society? What has it done? Like you said, 60 days, it's had the economic effect of what we experienced, perhaps worse than the Great Depression. Yet we still have, I mean, we're talking right now over the internet. We have electricity, communications, pure water, all of these things that we depend on, and people had still panicked and are in some cases still panicking. And so what I wanted to do is to use this as an opportunity for us to explore why it is that those critical infrastructures deserve such a focus for national security practitioners and a focus of effort from the civilian populace for them to understand the vulnerabilities of it, what they can do to help shore up those vulnerabilities, and then also what they can do on a personal or family or professional level to just be more prepared and resilient. So I'm interested in your thoughts on those solutions.
Sure, I'm hoping that the coronavirus will be a wake-up call to our political leaders about how incredibly fragile our society is. You know, as I noted before, the coronavirus doesn't deserve to be classified as one of the great plagues of history. You know, we are where we are, and the damage that has been done to us has really been done by bad decisions in reaction to the coronavirus. You know, the decision to shut down the economy was the government's decision. Social distancing is the government's decision, and people have obeyed that. And we have got shortages in our grocery stores. We were worried about food supplies, you know, for a while, you know, and all of this is not in reaction to a real existential threat, but a merely psychological threat. And I'm sure our adversaries in Russia, China, North Korea, elsewhere, have taken note of how vulnerable we are, even to a mere psychological threat, and how quickly society can fall apart. You know, before we had this, before the webinar began, you and I were talking about how the riots and protests that are going on, you know, the social disintegration that appears to be happening, you know, is probably also connected. You know, it's probably not an accident that this severe backlash and reaction is happening after 2 months of government overreaching. Some might compare it to the government putting its knee on the neck of the economy and on the neck of people's civil rights, and people's respect and tolerance for government is at a low point as we experience the ongoing crisis that we still haven't emerged from. And I'm sure our enemies are noticing that too. So what would happen if we got hit with a real existential threat, like an EMP, that did black out the country and took away our electronic civilization? You know, the effects would be catastrophic. And there's no excuse for it. Just like there's no excuse for what happened to the coronavirus. You know, we know how to protect against EMP. We've known since 1963 and have been protecting Department of Defense systems using Faraday cages and blocking devices and surge arresters and other technologies, you know, since that period. You know, it's really just been a question of political will. You know, the EMP Commission has recommended that we harden the electric grid and all the critical infrastructures. Transformers, for example, and generators can be protected from the EMP with surge arresters and blocking devices. SCADAs can be protected by being housed in Faraday cages. It wouldn't cost that much money. You know, we calculated that it would cost between $2 to $4 billion to protect the bulk power system. And if that were combined with smart planning by the utilities and by the Department of Homeland Security, it would basically solve the problem. You know, we would know when EMP had happened. There would be a period of great inconvenience, like there is with, you know, with normal type of blackouts. You know, a blackout might even last a couple of weeks, but we would be able to come out of it very quickly and avoid the worst case scenario where millions of people die from starvation and society falls apart. You know, from you know, the way it did in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, as you know. So we know how to solve the problem. And it's not a technological problem. It's not a money problem because it doesn't cost that much. It's a political problem. You know, it's having the political will to actually do something about it. And fortunately, we have President Trump now. I mean, we have actually won the policy battle. Even there, we have an EMP executive order from President Trump to protect the critical infrastructures. The Congress seconded the motion in the FY 2020 National Defense Authorization Act that said we agree with the president. And as a matter of law, you've got to implement this EMP executive order. And you guys are going to report to us, not just to the White House, to ensure that we're actually doing it, which is why I wrote my book, because even all of that, Tommy, even all of that isn't getting the job done. You know, I'm afraid we're seeing the same thing happen with EMP preparedness that has happened with the failure to implement biological warfare preparedness. You know, so incompetent and so corrupt is the deep state, the administrative government that we have to deal with.
And that's, Peter, I wanted to take a moment to just commend to the viewers the power and the light. We'll put it in the webpage when we're done. We're going to have a summary of this webinar and a link to Dr. Pry's book, an excellent history of the Congressional EMP Commission. And I know, Peter, that the title itself, The Power and the Light, has meaning because the work that the commission has done really has been a light in darkness, and a lot of the power that's out there they've had to fight against when it comes to the power of the utility industry. Now, part of our Secure the Grid Coalition's efforts has been to encourage people to be more prepared. As Peter mentioned, if there were a blackout and people had a couple weeks worth of what they need to take care of themselves, society would not break down as much. But I distinctly remember, because the deeper that you dive into this topic, the more it may make you just kind of want to run to the frontier. And I remember, Peter, you telling me once that, you know, the founders of this country had an infinite frontier to run to. And instead, they turned and they fought tyranny. And so part of what I want to commend Dr. Pry for is his efforts to lead the nation in fighting that tyranny of inaction, which has existed for 2 decades after almost 2 decades after the knowledge of electromagnetic pulse became unclassified. And so, Peter, I want to thank you for being really, I think, the preeminent leader of that movement, for having provided for me and others such an education on this topic, and for giving us, the marching orders on how to fight this fight against the tyranny of inaction. We do have just under 20 minutes left, and I really feel like it would be good to see what sort of questions we have from around the audience. I know we had just about 200 that were registered, and perhaps even more than that that are on right now. So I think if it's good with you, Peter, for us to give a moment, Adam Savit is able to receive those questions, and he can provide those to us, and I'd like to give Peter the opportunity, particularly to answer those.
Certainly, we have a bunch. I'm going to combine two that are pretty much the same. Why hasn't the infrastructure been hardened? And then a little bit more elaborate, describe the resistance to protecting the grid from the electric power industry. I'm always puzzled by it. They appear concerned about cost reliability, but why are they so adamant about these issues, given they would be among that 90%?
Well, it's hard to give a short answer to that question. That's the subject matter of my whole book, The Power and the Light, that goes into great detail about what has happened. The short answer is, well, there's a lot of reasons why the grid isn't hardened yet. Part of it is the fault of the Defense Department, and I have to take some responsibility too as a member of the intelligence community. Up until the EMP Commission came around, which wasn't until 2004 when we did our first report in 2004, we knew about the EMP threat, but it was all classified. It was deeply classified. And we were relying on the principle of mutual assured destruction, of deterrence, to protect the nation, and thought that, well, if the Soviet Union attempted an EMP attack against us, we would destroy all their cities with nuclear strikes, and so they'll be deterred, and so we don't have to worry about protecting the civilian electric grid or other critical infrastructures, and because this was such a serious and significant vulnerability, the Department of Defense and the intelligence community kept it classified. They didn't want to tell anybody about how serious the EMP threat was. And back in those days, North Korea didn't have the bomb. Iran wasn't near the bomb. China was our ally during the Cold War. We were only really worried about the Soviet Union. And it wasn't until later, when we saw that North Korea could acquire nuclear weapons, Iran could acquire nuclear weapons, maybe terrorists could get their hands on a bomb, and if terrorists did, they could do an EMP attack, even using a balloon. That we said, well, maybe it was a big mistake, to have kept this quiet, because we actually need to do what the Russians and Chinese have already done, which is to harden our critical infrastructures against EMP. So that's one reason, keeping the threat classified for too long. The other reason is, Washington is slow to learn. Even though it's been 20 years since we broached, well, it's been less than 20 years. 2004 was our first report. So it's been less than 20 years. But, the Washington bureaucracy, they think they know everything. And if they've never heard about a threat like EMP or cyber or something like that, they want to do business as usual. They don't want to learn anything new. This is the characteristics of the deep state and the incompetent bureaucracy that has given us the catastrophe of the coronavirus, for example. It's a consequence of these guys not doing their jobs and playing the Washington game. Part of the Washington game, by the way, is to become rich without doing anything. If you look at one might ask, well, what happened to all those resources that went into, for example, biological warfare preparedness? Well, I'll tell you, what happened is that a lot of senior executive service positions that pay very high were created to deal with it. A lot of money was spent on reports that went to contractors who would re-examine the issue. How serious is the biological warfare threat? That serious? Is this solution good? Is that another solution? So they would do endless studies. And in Washington, doing endless studies is considered action. okay? Even if not a single ventilator gets stored in a warehouse anywhere, if you're doing a study to come up with the optimum solution, then you're acting on the problem. And that's how we got to the coronavirus thing. And you want to know where the resources went? Somebody should take a helicopter and film all these mansions that exist outside the Beltway, you know, where the senior executive service people live. It went into their pockets, you know. And I'm very much afraid the same phenomena is happening here with EMP, where they want to do endless studies and profit from the threat. They don't. It's not enough for them to just accept, hey, the Department of Defense and the EMP Commission know all about this. We've already done all the studies that are needed. We've provided you with a blueprint. Go forward and implement that blueprint. They don't make money that way. It also disempowers them. We want to make sure they're in charge, okay? That they've got power over this problem. That's the government problem. That's part of it. So it's just sheer stupidity and incompetence. That's part of the reason. Another part of the reason is ideological. You know, the left hates all nuclear threats. You know, the left is strongly anti-nuclear. There's a whole cottage industry in the liberal mainstream media. They're all against, for example, President Trump's nuclear modernization program. We have to defend it every day against the Washington Post, the New York Times. You know, these guys close their eyes to Russia and China and North Korea whenever they're building nuclear weapons and threatening the United States. But as soon as the United States starts moving in the nuclear direction to modernize its forces so we can deter these guys, the left starts yelling and screaming as long, and this includes the Democrat Party and their allies in the liberal mainstream media. They have a visceral hatred of nuclear weapons, and most Americans do. You know, nuclear weapons are not nice. They are weapons of mass destruction, and they are antithetical to the principle of Judeo-Christian civilization and to a society that derives its power from the consent of the governed. So even conservative people are uncomfortable with weapons of mass destruction. And these people have seen EMP as a conspiracy by right-wing people like myself to try to support modernizing our nuclear arsenal and reacting to the nuclear threat. The EMP threat also attacked some of the sacred cows on the left. You know, for example, the Iran nuclear deal. You know, it was sold to Congress and to the American people on the idea that, well, we can have a nuclear deal. We can cut a deal with Iran, even though they're 6 months to a year from the bomb. That doesn't really matter because there's not much they could do. Even if they break out of the Iran nuclear deal, there's not much you can do with 1 or 2 nuclear weapons. It would matter that much, okay? We'd have time to respond to the nuclearization of Iran. But EMP knocks that argument into a cocked hat because if Iran did an EMP attack, all they need is 1 or 2 nuclear weapons, and they could take us out as a civilization. So it attacked the Iran nuclear deal. But also, the climate changers don't like EMP because it's a rival existential threat to the alleged existential threat we supposedly face from climate change. And the solutions that the EMP Commission has for protecting against EMP, the climate change people don't like that either. You know, because the most resilient forms of energy against any threat, really, but including EMP, are hydropower, nuclear power, and coal.
Right.
And the Greenpeace people want all those sources of electrical energy to go away and to be replaced with something else. So right. That's 2 answers to your question. You know, first, gross incompetence and stupidity. Second, ideological issues. And then third, the third part of that answer is, you know, the electric power industry, the utilities, of which there are 3,000 in the United States. They're the last critical infrastructure that is still, they still operate in a 19th century regulatory environment, which is to say they're not regulated at all. They basically regulate themselves. Every other major critical infrastructure is well regulated by the federal government. The airline industry, for example, we have the Federal Aviation Administration. And because hundreds of people's lives are at stake when an airplane flies, you know, when an airplane crashes, the airline industry doesn't get to inspect that crash. The FAA drags the remnants into a hangar to find out if it was pilot error or mechanical error or what went wrong. And the FAA does exercise its power, its very great power, to force the airline industry to fix the problem. Whether
right? The FAA, if an aircraft crashed, the FAA wouldn't hide the name or the brand of the aircraft, or the airline company would. That would be a
category of Boeing airliners because they were unsafe. Nothing like that exists for the electric power industry, and they want to continue. They want to continue that regulatory environment where they regulate themselves, and they're afraid of losing that power and influence over themselves.
Right.
And they don't have the competence. They pretend to have the competence as a way of protecting themselves from regulation. They claim that they have the greatest expertise on EMP and cyber threats and sabotage. But if anybody were to think about that for a moment, you could see that's untrue. Where would they get that expertise? We don't have the U.S. Navy SEALs or the Green Berets running the electric power industry. There aren't nuclear weapons scientists and EMP experts in the electric power industry, even though they write bogus reports. They're not written by experts. They're written by non-experts, and that's propaganda. It's no more respectable than the independent laboratory assessments that the cigarette industry used to write back in the 1950s and 60s to prove that there was no causal linkage between smoking and lung cancer. That's how bad their work is. And the last thing I guess I should mention, and I apologize for this being such a long answer to your question, but so you've got three, the bureaucratic political interests of the utilities, ignorance and stupidity of the bureaucracy, and ideological reasons from the left. But last, we're an open society, and I don't know how much influence, but I think it's considerable. I believe that both our government and our utilities have been penetrated, manipulated by hostile foreign adversaries. It makes entire sense that they would do that. I think of Klaus Fuchs, who was an atomic spy that penetrated and did grave damage to our national security back in the 1950s. The Soviets, the Russians, the Chinese, even the Cubans are very good at penetrating those parts of the U.S. government which are hardest to penetrate. We had our expert in the Defense Intelligence Agency on Cuba for many years, turned out to be a Cuban intelligence officer that was running that. Think of how much easier it is to penetrate NERC and FERC and the electric utilities that aren't part of our intelligence community. They're not part of our defense community. You don't have to be polygraphed or have background investigations done to join those industries. So a lot of and we know that EPRI, who is one of the worst, the Electric Power Research Institute that represents the utilities, they get 40% of their research budget from foreign actors. China and Russia are members of good standing with EPRI. A member of the Edison Electric Institute was awarded a medal by the Chinese communists. Why did he get a medal? Okay, so those I think in combination, those are the reasons nothing has been done yet to harden the grid, and those are difficult things to overcome when you're just a handful of people with almost no resources.
So Peter, I really appreciated that four-pronged answer. In fact, and Adam, just so you know, I've got the Q&A piece now. I can see these questions. That answer, Peter, covered a number of the questions that are here. What I want to do real quick is just scroll through and address a couple more, since we only have about 5 more minutes. And so one of the things that was noted, and let me just say this, what Peter just described with the worrisome connections from China to the grid lobbyists, to how the grid industry is self-regulated and the political influence that they have over government, all of that is documented at our website, securethegrid.com. In fact, right now, you can get involved in helping us really correct a cover-up that's been in existence for 10 years, where the violators of cybersecurity and physical security requirements, the critical infrastructure protection standards for the grid, those companies that violate those rules, their identities are never made public. The government covers that up. And so we've been involved in almost a 2-year struggle for transparency. You can get involved in that right now at securethegrid.com. And each one of the items that Peter just mentioned, if you go to the news tab and just scroll on the right, you will see article after article. I want to address a couple of the questions. There were questions about, can there be something on Netflix to educate people? Absolutely. I spent the day in Atlanta yesterday trying to raise funds for a documentary called The Black Sky Event. If you go to the blackskyevent.com and you watch the trailer, you're going to hear that the entire thing is narrated by Dr. Peter Pry. Phenomenal. And it's about 80 or 90% complete. We're just trying to raise the money for that. So we are undertaking that effort to get that out on Netflix and to raise the specter with the American public. Some of you talked about the fact that we just have to bypass government because government is not moving fast enough. I will tell you that there are efforts underway to do that. Ambassador Hank Cooper at Lake Wiley in the North Carolina, South Carolina region has been working from the bottom up. That's going to be something that'll be featured in that documentary. Dr. Pry has, of course, been working very closely with Ambassador Cooper on that. There are, in fact, some efforts within government that are making promising developments, such as in San Antonio with the Electromagnetic Defense Task Force there. And our coalition, Peter Pry's task force, has provided invaluable assets and capabilities to all of these movements because the good civil servants in government who are trying to do the right thing, they have to go somewhere for the right information. And that's what Dr. Pry has consistently, time and again, been that bastion of truth, even when it wasn't popular. And that's why I said at the very beginning of this, that he has sacrificed everything. And Dr. Pry will tell you where you're sitting with the American flag behind you in a log cabin in the hills of Virginia personifies what you've given. You're not in a mansion sitting outside of Washington, D.C. Beltway, right? You've got the American flag right behind you. And what I'll tell you is that, I have one here with me as well, one that I've carried on every deployment, folded like this in my rucksack. And I only unfolded that flag in a combat zone when, for example, we were over mountains in Afghanistan, over Saddam Hussein's palaces in Iraq, over the city of Fallujah on September 11th, 2005. And what I learned from Dr. Pry and others is that the fight is no longer over there, it's here. And so every time I have the opportunity to go and share the truth about these threats and the need for us to defend against them, I bring that flag with me and bring it there, and we pledge our allegiance to it. And so, Dr. Pry, I just wanted to take this last minute to thank you for your time here on the webinar and give you really the last closing comments for this webinar, because I think you deserve a hell of a lot more than that, but certainly the final closing comments, sir.
Well, thank you so much, Tommy. I greatly appreciate it. And I thank your audience, for being patriots and participating in this webinar to learn about the greatest threat that our civilization faces. One last word about what people can do. I have another book called Blackout Wars that was published years ago. You don't have to wait for Washington, and you shouldn't wait for Washington. It is possible for a state to harden its own grid. If you harden the electric infrastructure within a state, and that's another thing that I and the Secure the Grid Coalition have done. We've tried to advance legislation to protect state grids in places like Texas and Maine and elsewhere, Florida. But in that book, there's a 1.5-page executive order, a blank executive order. And there's also a blank piece of legislation that's just 2 pages long. If you got the governor of your state to sign that executive order, or if you got a state legislature to pass that legislation and just put in the name of that state, it would begin the process of protecting that state. So you wouldn't have to wait for Washington. You could get the home state that you live in, your family and your neighbors, you could get it protected. And these are the kinds of things people should be engaged in. Just think of how much easier it is to try to get government to do its job at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. I do believe in personal preparedness. People should have a food supply. They should have a medicine kit, know how to use it. They should be prepared basically for anything. But that personal preparedness, that takes much more time, much more expense than the simple act of a little bit of political activism, a little bit of patriotism to try to get the government bureaucracy off its laurels and do the job they're paid for. So thank you so much for having me, Tommy. I appreciate the opportunity to address your audience.
Absolutely. Sir, it's an honor to have you here. We'll produce after this a synopsis with all the links to the things, the resources that we mentioned. And again, you can find that at securethegrid.com. So folks, thanks again for joining us. I do also want to put a plug in for the next 2 webinars. Dr. Pry mentioned a lot about biological defense, and our Center for Security Policy President, Fred Fleitz, will be doing a webinar focused specifically on that topic of biological defense. So just look at the webinars tab at centerforsecuritypolicy.org. So thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll see you next week, same time, same day for our next webinar.